Okay, welcome fourth graders to another voice thread. We are continuing our discussion about California and it becoming a state. We are on chapter 6, lesson 3. I'm on page 246 and 247. California becomes a state. Okay, this is what's going on here. In 1847, the United States took control of California. But since that time, California was just controlled by military officials. Now, at the beginning, nobody really cared about this a whole lot. They didn't argue against it. But after the gold rush, when a lot more people started to come to California, a lot of the newcomers wanted the same rights as citizens of the United States did. At this time, though, the United States Congress was busy dealing with issues and conflicts over slavery. The northern states of the United States were free states, and the states in the southern part of the United States were slave states. So the Congress was dealing with that issue, so they did not have the time to take up the issue of whether California should become a part of the United States instead of just being run by these military officials. Well, there was this gentleman named General Bennett Riley, the new military governor of California. He decided to call for a convention at Monterey. Decisions would be made about California's future. Delegates were elected to attend this convention. A delegate is a person who is chosen to speak on behalf of somebody else. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the next picture here. This doesn't really go with what we're going to be discussing here, so I guess I'll just go back. A Constitution for California. I'm on page 248. Okay, so this meeting was set to happen. The Californians elected 48 delegates to attend this convention. They included both new immigrants and old ones, as well as Californio families such as Mariano Vallejo. He had been living in California since Spanish rule. He was one of the 8 Californios elected to the convention. The delegates quickly decided that California should become a state, but next they had to decide what kind of state California was going to be, or what land California was going to occupy. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had set California's southern border with Mexico. The Pacific Ocean set the western boundary of California, and then the northern border was the Oregon Territory, so they needed to figure out what would be the eastern border of California. Should California include all of the land that the United States had gained from Mexico? The delegates decided against this. They thought the area would be too large to govern. They decided that the eastern boundary of California should be marked by the Sierra Nevada and the Colorado River. Another decision that the delegates had to think about was whether California was going to be a slave or a free state. In slave states, people were allowed to own slaves. In free states, they were not. All of the delegates voted that California should be a free state. They also needed to figure out what kind of education system California was going to have. They called for the creation of a state public school system. This is a picture of the first graduating class of the first high school in San Francisco, and this was in 1859. Okay. Continuing on, all of these decisions that these delegates concluded or thought about and agreed upon were written into a constitution or plan of government. In just 6 weeks, the delegates wrote the Constitution of 1849. It gave Californians new rights and freedoms. For the first time, Californian citizens would have a voice in their own government. They could now vote for their leaders, such as governor and members of the state legislature. A legislature is a group of officials elected to make laws. So now the people could vote for delegates, and these people would make decisions. For example, the governor and members of state legislature. In November of 1849, the people of California voted to ratify or approve the new Constitution. Okay, I'm on page 250 now. The 31st state. Californians' 2 senators were sent to Washington, D.C. to approach Congress about California becoming a state. This request set off a huge debate in Congress because there were an even number of slave and free states. So once California became the 31st state, it would make it imbalanced because California wanted to be a free state. So there would be more free than slave states, and this kind of created a major conflict. The South was slave, the North was free. Finally, members of Congress worked out a compromise. People on each side of the argument agreed to give up something. Under the Compromise of 1850, they passed a law called the Fugitive Slave Act that said anyone who was caught helping an escaped slave would be punished. California officially became a state on September 9th, 1850. A couple things that they had to talk about now that they had become a state. They had to figure out where they were going to have their capital. At first it was in Monterey, then it got moved to San Jose, then it was moved to Vallejo, then Benicia, and finally it ended in Sacramento. They also had to figure out what they were going to do with taxes. Because there were so many miners in California that did not own land, they could not collect property tax, so that wouldn't work. Also, banks in the United States did not want to loan money to California, so there was definitely some difficulty there in how they were going to figure out taxes. Okay, let's go ahead and move on here. Now, the end of ranchos. Remember, ranchos were these large estates where they raised animals. These large estates were often built right next to the presidios and the missions, and it was one of the ways Spain kind of controlled or occupied their land. Now, here's the end of the ranchos. Okay, the state faced this huge issue or this trouble over land ownership. Many people who stayed in California after the gold rush lived on unmarked lands that were part of ranchos. Okay, so they lived in these areas that were unmarked. This led to arguments over who owned what land. To settle these disputes, the United States Congress passed the Land Act. This law said that the rancheros or rancho owners had to prove that the land belonged to them. Now, this was hard for a lot of the rancheros to do. Most of them did not speak English, and few government officials spoke Spanish. It was also difficult for the rancheros to prove that they had received their land grants legally, since they got many of their land grants from Mexico. In addition, the hand-drawn disueños, those were those hand-drawn maps of what the land was going to look like, were often not correct. Okay, here is some vocabulary that you are going to need to know. A convention is a large, important meeting. A delegate is a person chosen to speak and act for the people who elected him or her. And constitution is a plan of government. Okay, I want you to answer 2 questions here from this lesson. Question number 1 is on page 247. How did the feelings of Californians about the military rule change with the gold rush? Okay, why did they want something new after the gold rush instead of military rule? Question number 2 is on page 249. It is, how was California's new government different from its government of the past? Okay, I want you to answer those 2 questions. Feel free to leave any other questions or comments for either myself or your other classmates to answer. And I look forward to seeing you in class. Hope you've enjoyed this voice thread.